Our final speaker is Dr. William Thomas. Dr. Thomas is currently Professor of Mariology at Newman College in Ireland. He was a member of the Pontifical Marian Academy and director of the St. John Paul Institute of Marian Studies. He has published over 2,000 articles on the Blessed Virgin Mary and related devotional articles, and is currently pursuing a second doctorate at the Pontifical University Regina Apostolorum in Rome with a thesis on St. Bernadette of Lourdes and her link with Blessed Pope Pius IX. And by the way, he was kind enough to share a couple miraculous present-day stories with me, and I begged him last night, please, doctor, share these with the entire group. And he said, well, I'll need a little bit more time. And I said, you've got it. We'll build it in. So speaking on the topic, Fatima and the problem of Russia, the consecration, and the errors spoken of by Our Lady, please join me in welcoming Dr. William Thomas.
Good afternoon. I hope you all had a good coffee break and you're all wide awake. Some requests. A gentleman came to me after my talk yesterday and he said, would you write a book on high heels and handbags? And I said, no. And then there was somebody looking for a sign of a miracle. And I said, when I present my paper in time tomorrow, that's today, it will be a miracle if I can do it on time. So that will be your Fatima miracle this year. We've just seen the miracle of the sun. I want to relay, I have been asked to relay one of the miracles, many miracles that happen in regard to the relics. As I said yesterday, the saints know where their relics are at any one moment. They know who it is that's venerating them and who has been blessed by them. And we have arranged after Holy Communion during Mass that the relics will be placed on the altar and you will receive a blessing through the relic of Pope St. John Paul II. On my way, before I went up to Newman College, a year before I went up to Newman College, I received a phone call from the Friars of the Renewal, Father Andrew Apostoli, who asked if I would bring the relics up to their parish in Derry. And I'd never heard from him for a whole year. I had it penciled in my diary. And subsequently, when I was driving up to Newman College, I got a phone call from a journalist to say, we understand you're over in St. Joseph's Parish in Derry tonight. And I said, well, that's news to me. So eventually I got a phone call from the parish. It was one of the friars. And he said, are you coming here tonight? I said, it was never confirmed. Somebody asked me, but they never confirmed it. They said, well, just a moment. And then he said, now I'm on my knees. Will you please come to the parish tonight? And I said, well, I'm scheduled to lecture at Newman College, but I'll make a few phone calls and I'll do my best. So I arrived at the parish. It's a large parish like this, maybe 1,000 people, 1,200 people. And I set up the display. I couldn't find any of the friars, so I set up a display on a table in front of the altar with the picture of the suffering Pope. You probably got the pictures there yesterday, the cards with the novena, where we've started the novena to Pope St. John Paul II on the 13th through to the 22nd. His feast day is coming up. Anyway, I set it up, and then a lady offered me about that much of a seat to sit down. And I thanked her very much. I sat next to her. She had a scarf on her. Well, it didn't bother me because in the cold October evenings in Ireland, as you know, it can be quite chilly and damp and so on and so forth. But I sat next to her and I said to her, with great confidence, I said, whatever you want from Pope John Paul tonight, you tell him, you tell him what you want, and tell him one of his friends and collaborators has said so. I worked with Pope John Paul for 15 years in the Apostolic Palace. So you tell him that I said to ask. Now, I didn't know what this woman's condition was, but it turns out she was completely bald. She had no hair. And she wore the scarf at home day and night. She didn't want her children to see her. She didn't want her friends to know. She was very embarrassed about the condition. So she went up for the blessing, and as it happened, we have two first-class relics of Pope St. John Paul II. One of them is here, his hair, and the other, his blood. So she went up, and one of the priests placed the relic on her head and prayed and asked the intercession of Pope John Paul for her. And she began to weep. And 30 miles away, her daughter was asleep in bed in a little town called Coleraine. And she woke up and went to the grandmother and said, "Mammy is crying, but I don't know why." And subsequently on the way home, her 15-year-old boy said, "Mammy, will you turn the heating down in the car? I'm sweating." And the mother said, "There is no heating on in the car." He said, "Well, where's the heat coming from?" She said, "It's coming from my head." Her head was on fire. And she went to bed that night, and when she woke up in the morning and went to the bathroom, she began to scream and woke up the whole house and woke up the neighbors, who called the police, who eventually arrived and knocked on the bathroom door and said, "Mrs., please open the door, this is the police." And she opened the door, but she couldn't speak. She had a full head of hair that grew overnight. So God does effect miracles through relics and the relics of the saints. And if you really want a miracle, ask Pope John Paul today and tell him I said so. Now, the miracle of getting this paper out and getting it presented before you have dinner. The message of Fatima is here to prepare the world for the second coming of Christ. There will not be a Fatima II. This is it. This is the catechesis. This is the pathway. The fundamental question of Fatima is asked on the 13th of May by little Lucia. Will I go to heaven? That's what Our Lady came into the world to do, to show us a pathway to God. Will I go to heaven? That's a question that each one of us must ask ourselves every day and follow the pathway under her mantle, her protection. What I would like to speak about is the problem of Russia and on its consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and what the errors of Russia are, as spoken about by Our Lady in 1929, and how these errors are spread around the world even today. The third apparition of Our Lady at the Cova da Iria on the 13th of July 1917 is considered to be the most intense and important of all the apparitions in Fatima. An apparition which singled out only one country by name that heaven wanted consecrated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. This was the same secret in which the so-called three secrets were given, which we know, in fact, was one secret in three parts. I could relay, or maybe I should relay, but I'm going to try and expedite and skip some of my talk in order that you don't starve to death. So to relay part of that secret with the exact words to the children. And this is what Our Lady said. You have seen hell, where the souls of poor sinners go. To save them, God wishes to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart. If what I say to you is done, many souls will be saved and there will be peace. The war is going to end. We just saw the film clip there. If people do not cease offending God, a worse one will break out during the pontificate of Pius XI. He hadn't even been elected. The Second World War. The Pope was, at the time of the apparitions, was Benedict XV. When you see a night illumined by an unknown light. Many people refer to this as the aurora borealis. The problem with that is a known light. The light that was seen all over the world was an unknown light and remains to this day to be an unknown light. And this would be the sign that God would give, that he is about to punish the world for its crimes. Our Lady said, to prevent this, I shall come to ask for the consecration of Russia. This is the same sentence, and this is very important, because I'm going to shout out the conjunction. To prevent this, I shall come to ask for the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart and the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays. Did you get it? Same sentence, and the communion of reparation. Somehow we have separated this. If my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the church. And as Colin Donovan told us, the good will be martyred, the Holy Father will have much to suffer, various nations will be annihilated. But in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and she will be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. Alas, that period of peace is now over. Note what Our Lady says in that. She mentions Russia 4 times in this apparition. What is going to happen in Russia specifically that is going to affect the world or affected the world from 1917? A little background on Russia and why Russia was important. The Christianization of Russia will help us to understand a little bit more Our Lady's concern. As you know, Russia is the largest landmass country in the world, with today a population of 145 million in all of its 22 republics. They were all the same color on the maps back in the 60s, and they were called the USSR. So when that fell, we began to hear countries like Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and so on and so forth that we had never heard of before. From the time of Vladimir Sviatoslevich the Great, who was the king of Russia, of all Russia, just before the first millennium, he was baptized. And because he was baptized a Christian, all of Russia in 988 were baptized because of that act of faith on his behalf. That was 988, baptism of Rus. Russia was now totally Christianized and Catholic for the first millennium, and it remained so until 1917. Russia, in October of 1917, there began an open demonic revolt against God under the dictatorship of what was called the Bolshevik Revolution, and with it Marxist-Leninism and later Stalinism. There are 2 aspects to any revolution. The first is the bloody revolution itself. And we had that in 1917 with the slaughter of millions upon millions of people and the complete destruction of society. The second aspect or phase of revolution is called the Cultural Revolution, which I'll speak about shortly. The purpose of these socialite proletariat governments of Russia was primarily focused on the elimination of any and all religious beliefs throughout Russia, first, and then on the global scale to the rest of the world. What happened here is beyond doubt tied into the prophetic vision of Pope Leo XIII in 1884 about something that was to occur in 1917 and the unleashing of demons into this land so dedicated to the Mother of God. The Russian state, Soviets, advocated the complete destruction of religion. It officially pronounced religious beliefs to be superstitious and backward. The Communist Party destroyed churches, ridiculed, harassed, incarcerated, and executed religious leaders, flooded the schools and media with anti-religious teachings, and introduced a belief system called scientific atheism with its own rituals, promises, and proselytizers, who are now poised to spread their errors, their ungodly errors, not just in Russia, but around the world, and the ultimate aim of that was to wipe out Christianity from the hearts and minds of all believers. And they have been successful. And I include many countries in this. Militant atheism, the first fruit of the evil revolt against God, became central to the ideology of the Communist Party of the newly established Soviet Union. In fact, it became a high priority policy of all Soviet leaders up until its collapse in 1992. One can clearly see the fingerprints and footprints of Satan emerge from the minds and hearts of men during this time. Men who hated God and those who still hate him. Lenin demanded that communist propaganda must employ militancy and irreconcilability towards all forms of idealism and religion. That became known as militant atheism. Militant here, what I mean by that, is the uncompromising, intolerable attitude towards any religion, but specifically the Catholic and Orthodox Church. Among the common tactics were confiscating church property, ridiculing religion, harassing believers, propagating atheism in the schools, shutting down the seminaries, and so on and so forth. During the first 5 years of Soviet power, the Bolsheviks executed 28 Russian bishops and over 1,200 Russian priests, while others were imprisoned in the gulags or exiled to remote places where they were left alone to die from starvation or were frozen to death in the dark winters. 579 monasteries were burned to the ground, their priests murdered, their nuns raped first and then shot dead, and many other executions of the religious well underway. In Ukraine, the Soviets murdered 7,000 priests and all of its 30 bishops. The laity were to be re-educated in atheism. And they decided to use the media to propagate what President Trump would call fake news, which people seem to have accepted without question. In 1922, the Solevsky Camp of Special Purposes, a former Russian concentration camp, was established in the White Sea, and between the years 1917 to 35, 130,000 Russian Orthodox priests were arrested, 95,000 were put to death, executed by firing squad with no trial. So you can see the devil at work here in particular. During the purges of 37 and 38, when Lucia was writing her memoirs, church documents recorded that 168,300 Russian Orthodox clergy were arrested, out of which 100,000 were murdered. Many millions of innocent victims of persecution became recognized in a special canon of the saints, now known as the New Martyrs and Confessors of Russia. Russia, from 1917 onwards, did persecute the Church, and the Holy Father did indeed have much to suffer, culminating with the attempted assassination of him in 1981, and right up to the last death of a priest by the Soviets with the martyrdom of Father Jerzy Popolushku in 1984, all of which was foretold in 1917. In 1929, and it's a very interesting year, I'd love to have more time to speak to you about 1929. I will just mention one thing, it's not on my script, but I will mention one thing about 1929. In 1929, Emil Wojtyła, the mother of Karol Wojtyła, died on the 13th of April. On the 13th of May, this little 9-year-old boy was consoling his father about the death of his mother. He was consoling his father. And he told his father that his mother's death was the will of God. Can you imagine that? And on the 13th of May, he went to a chapel and he asked Our Lady to be his mother. 13th of May, 1929. Isn't that extraordinary? So what happens in 1929? Our Lady appears in the 13th of June to Lucia in the convent in Tui. And she says, the moment has come in which God asks the Holy Father, who happened to be 9 years old, in union with all the bishops of the world, to make the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart, promising to save it by this means. The moment had come in 1929 to consecrate Russia. Pius XI, who was foretold, as I said, in 1917, was now the Pope. This particular Pope knew what the Soviets were up to. He condemned communism, and he saw it spread outside of Russia, especially to Spain and Mexico. He wrote 7 encyclical letters condemning communism. The first of these, and I'm going to give them in the Latin, but don't worry about it. If you don't understand it, you can get the DVD and write it down, and then you can Google it and you can read it in English. The first of these was called Ubi Arcani de Concilio in 1922, and later Quas Primas in 1925, followed by Quadragesimo Anno in 1931, where he explicitly condemns totalitarian communism and socialistic regimes as being irreconcilable with the Catholic faith. Instead, he called for a society to be based on solidarity and subsidiarity. On the 29th of June, 1931, he wrote Non abbiamo bisogno. For those who speak Italian, we don't need this. In which he condemned revolution. He also said that it inculcates hatred of God and the Church and turns its adherents into violent and irreverent men. On September 29th, 1932, he wrote Acebi Animi, on the sorrow of the soul, condemning what was going on against the dignity of man and the Church. And again on the 3rd of June, 1933, he wrote Delectissima Nobis. He condemns the communists, and he condemns what they were doing to the poor people of Russia, enslaving them with lies, similar to what's going on today in countries like North Korea. On the 19th of March, the Feast of St. Joseph, 1937, Pius XI promulgated the encyclical letter Divini Redemptoris, where he sets out to expose in a brief synthesis what the principles of atheistic communism exactly were, what was in Bolshevism, denouncing it at the same time and calling it the greatest heresy of all time. The encyclical describes communism as a system full of errors and sophisms, or false, cunning arguments that mislead people and subverts the social order. This subversion is carried out today by the School of Frankfurt, which I will mention shortly. In this encyclical, the Pope condemns the Western media for their conspiracy of silence in never writing about what the Bolsheviks were doing in Russia and around the world. He states that this modern revolution has actually broken out and threatens everyone everywhere, and that it exceeds in amplitude and violence, and upsetting the entire social order. Sister Lucia did not consign the third secret of Fatima to writing until 1944. She placed it in a sealed envelope on which she wrote on the outside, not to be opened until after 1960. Isn't that extraordinary? Extraordinary. While the popes clearly knew what was going on in Russia and realized the dangers of the errors coming out of Russia, which I will mention very shortly, they didn't know the specific requirements of the consecration and the threat to the world and the possibility of the annihilation of nations until after 1960. This secret was being kept for a specific pope, the one foreseen in Fatima in the July apparition of 1917. Eugenio Pacelli was elected Pope on the 2nd of March 1935, Pope Pius XII, at the outbreak of the Second World War. He was a staunch opponent of communism and of the Italian Communist Party in particular. In his first encyclical of the 20th of October 1939, he outrightly condemns totalitarianism and denounces Russia for its attack on Poland. In another encyclical called Anni Sacri of March 12, 1950, he advises the Catholic world on combating atheism. And he writes, "On the part of not a few, religion is passed by as a thing of no importance, and elsewhere absolutely prohibited in family and social life as a remnant of ancient superstitions. Public and private atheism is exalted in such a way that God and his law are being abolished and morals no longer have any foundation. The press also too often vulgarly reviles religious freedom." In 1936, while the Spanish Civil War was just beginning, which was known as the Red Terror because of its anti-clericalism and anti-God revolution, culminating in 7,000 murders of priests, nuns, and religious, with the destruction and burning of the churches throughout Spain. Pius XII went on to denounce communism in 1945, 48, and 50 in the following encyclicals: Miseredemptissimus Redemptor, Quadragesimus Annus, Caritas Christi, Acebi Animi, and, as I said, Delectissime Nobis. On the 7th of July 1952, the Pope did consecrate Russia and all the peoples of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in the apostolic letter Sacro Vergente. These words of this document are: "We consecrate the entire world to the Immaculate Heart of the Virgin Mother of God, so now in a special way consecrate all peoples of Russia to the very same Immaculate Heart." The Pope reminded the Russian people in this letter that the Virgin Mary is always victorious. The gates of hell will never prevail where she offers her protection. She is the good mother, the mother of all. And the Pope then dedicated all the peoples of Russia to her Immaculate Heart. Pope Saint John the 23rd was the first Pope of the late 50s and early 60s who was the first one to open the secret of Fatima on the 17th of August 1959. And according to the Vatican documents in the secret archives, where they keep a record of everybody who opens or reads these, his response was, "We shall wait. I shall pray. I shall let you know what I decide." His decision was to return the letter to the secret archives, deciding against revealing it publicly. His motives were simple. He had just called the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council 7 months earlier, and his full attention was focused on that. And besides, he was dying of stomach cancer. The second Pope to see the secret was Blessed Pope Paul VI. He consecrated Russia in the presence of the Vatican Council Fathers on the 21st November 1964. Cardinal Wyszynski was very strong in asking that all of the bishops present could join in the consecration, but the Pope did it on his own, for his own purposes or reasons. He went to Fatima on the 50th anniversary of the apparitions in 1967, the first Pope to visit there, and he met Sister Lucia. He had read the text before going there on the 27th of March 65, but said nothing about the contents, and returned the text to the secret archives. As Cardinal Montini, a secretary to Pius XII, he would have known about the consecration of Russia and so on and so forth. However, it's my contention that the consecration was reserved for the Pope foreseen in 1917. That's why it wasn't done. Pope John Paul I lasted but 33 days and died of a massive heart attack. His successor from Poland became known as Pope John Paul II, now a great saint. It was he who discovered after he was shot that the message of Fatima pertained to him. He immediately was given the grace to understand the urgency of the consecration, and thus from his hospital bed at the Policlinico Gemelli, he entrusted the world to Our Lady on the 7th of June, 1981. In so doing, he added the important phrase, "Also those whose act of entrustment you too await in a particular way." On the 13th of May, 1982, he went to Fatima for the first time. Many of you do not realize, but he was attacked again and wounded in a bayonet attack as he approached the Capellina by an ultra-Orthodox priest by the name of Francisco Kron from the Society of St. Pius X. Pope John Paul, there were 6 attempts on the Pope's life, by the way, not just the one that you might know of. Pope John Paul had earlier met with Sister Lucia, who told us via her recently published diary, of which there are 7,000 pages, that the Pope at the meeting in Fatima promised to consecrate the world in union with all the bishops of the world according to the 1929 apparition as soon as was possible. Given that, new communications ability was now available as opposed to the 60s or even during the war. We now have satellites and so on and so forth. The Pope adds at the end of the first paragraph of the consecration this profound expression. In a special way, we entrust and consecrate to you those individuals and nations which particularly need to be thus entrusted and consecrated. And added, the power of this consecration lasts for all time and embraces all individuals, peoples, and nations. It overcomes every evil that the spirit of darkness is able to awaken, and has in fact awakened in our times, in the heart of man and in his history. And he adds, Mother of the Church, enlighten the people of God along the paths of faith, hope, and love. Enlighten especially the peoples whose consecration and entrustment by us you are waiting. The invocations of the consecration are quite clear and indicate already that the errors of Russia, which we're going to speak about now, were already spread around the world and no longer confined to Russia as they were in 1929. Thus, it became absolutely necessary to consecrate the entire world explicitly, and that includes Russia as part of the world, and which also includes Russia implicitly, and get this, in pectore. The Pope consecrated Russia in pectore, in the heart. What I mean by that is, given the Petrine ministry of the Pope can create a cardinal in pectore, in the heart. If he can do that, he certainly can consecrate Russia. And if you look at the footage of the consecration of Russia, or the world, there is a notable pause. I recently, 2 weeks ago, I was in Zakopane in Poland for a Mariological Congress, and I told the bishops of Poland, this was the moment he did it in pectore. So Russia was converted, or Russia was consecrated, I beg your pardon. Russia was consecrated implicitly and in pectore. And that's part of the Petrine ministry. So he says, from famine and war, deliver us. From nuclear war and incalculable self-destruction, and from every kind of war, deliver us, and so on. All of these and more things mentioned constitute the errors of Russia, from readiness to trample on the commandments of God, from attempts to stifle in human hearts the very truth of God, from the loss of awareness of good and evil, constitute the errors of Russia that Our Lady had warned about. Again, I go back to the devotion to the 5 first Saturdays. If not, Russia will spread her errors. Sister Lucia, by the way, confirmed that the solemn and universal act of consecration corresponded to what Our Lady wished. It has been done, she said. In fact, the Pope phoned the monastery in Coimbra and asked Sister Lucia had she watched the television the day before, the day of the consecration, 25th of March, 1984, in which she said she did. And he asked her, did it correspond with what Our Lady had asked? And she said, sim este feita, tal como Nossa Senhora ha perdu desde o dia 25 de marzo, and so on. Yes, it has been done just as Our Lady asked on the 25th of March 1984. That was a letter published on the 8th of November 1989. So any further discussion or request is without basis. The two great authorities on Fatima were the Pope of Fatima, Pope St. John Paul II, and Sister Lucia. If anybody else says Russia was not consecrated, they're talking through their hats. Russia has been converted. Not necessarily to Catholicism, as many people think, but converted away from Soviet militant atheism. That's what's important. Russia is converted back to Christianity. So what are the errors of Russia? The silent apostasy that has taken place in the Christian world is down primarily to the spread of atheism that came from Russia. Its fundamental mantra is, there is no God. This comes in many manifestations, from Marxism to liberalism, even to libertinism, from collectivism to radical individualism, from atheism to a vague religious mysticism, from agnosticism to syncretism, and the dictatorship of relativism that does not recognize anything as definitive and whose ultimate goal consists solely on one's own ego and one's own desires. What we are facing now is the so-called second stage of communism, the Cultural Revolution. In 1923, Lenin himself set up a school of thought in Moscow, which he called the Institute of Social Sciences. This is the first time this word has come together, the Institute of Social Sciences. Its idea was to disseminate false ideas and a hatred of God. And after the Second World War, this school of thought was set up in opposition to the School of Mary in Fatima, the School of Holiness, which is now being confronted by a school of hatred of God and the subversion of the natural order. This school of thought moved from Moscow to Frankfurt and has become known as the School of Frankfurt. It's the most influential school of thought in the world today. It is Marxist-Leninist in its orientation, and it seeks social and educational subversion. The subversion of order is diabolical in origin. The right order of things is goodness. God's order and the order of nature is goodness. But by subverting that order is to disobey God and what God has established. This highly influential school of Frankfurt has infiltrated not only the United Nations, the European Union, Hollywood, and you name it. They've got their fake news, their pornography, their propaganda, their movies, you name it. It's in there, embedded. The major works of this school of Frankfurt include escape from freedom, one-dimensional man, the negative dialectics, and reason and revolution. Because for them, there is no absolute truth, which is another way of saying there is no God. This school of Frankfurt is a diabolical way, the conduit, if you like, as foretold by Our Lady of Fatima as a caveat. If not, Russia would spread its errors. As a result, a direct result of the subversion of the natural order and the emerging sexual perversions of the so-called same-sex marriage, and with it polyamorous marriage and the gender-neutral ideology, the complete breakdown of the moral authority in the world today, where 10% of the entire population of the world boast about being atheist. That amounts to 700 million people who have no belief in God whatsoever. We know that when a society tries to remove religion, and in particular Christianity, it becomes a society hell-bent on its own destruction. There is an orchestrated movement still in place today to weaken and to destroy the Catholic Church. Many Catholics have become ashamed to express their faith publicly. Parents have stopped teaching their children and handing on the faith. Some believe that the Church has failed in its mission. In fact, here in the United States, in the last 10 years, 10 million Catholics have left the Catholic Church. That's the silent apostasy. Ultimately, Marxist-Leninist cultural communism that we're speaking about is about the destruction of the human person, the human family, and the destruction of the civilized society and the Catholic Church, all of which are under attack. Further errors from Russia include evolutionist materialism as opposed to God having created the world and man. The class struggle deprives man of his liberty and dignity. The false notion of absolute equality, which rejects all hierarchy and authority as coming from God, and even of parents, claiming that all authority and subordination are derived from society. The negation of the right of private ownership. We see people being disenfranchised every day. The rejection of the sacred character of human life and of the family, denying the indissoluble bonds of marriage, and opening the doors to divorce and other forms of marriage recognized by the state. And so by default, the family, the core of society, is being destabilized. These are the errors that Our Lady spoke about. Russia will spread her errors. The robbing of parental rights to educate their own children, because parents are, after all, the natural teachers. The negation of law and perennial morals, so everything becomes changeable with earthly values which shift from one day to another. The 10 Commandments, the roadmap to sanctity, are being abolished. Lenin replaced the Blessed Trinity and created a false ideology contrary to the first commandment, thou shalt not have strange gods before me. The world today blasphemes the holy name of Jesus, contrary to the second commandment. In 1922, the Soviets established the League of Militant Atheists, who propagated that Jesus Christ was the sole obstacle to a communist world revolution. The third commandment, to keep holy the Sabbath day. The communists destroyed the churches. They killed the clergy to prevent people from doing just that. And instead, they developed anti-religious carnivals and sports and their ungodly parades to blaspheme God on Sundays. Sunday now has become a day of sport. That's one of the errors of Russia. It must always be the day of the Lord. The fourth commandment, honor your father and mother. They made parents kill their children and children kill their parents and betray each other to society because the political party was dearer to them than the family. The fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. Murder was the name of the game in Russia from 1917 to 1985, and murder is still on the menu there. The Soviets developed concentration camps on which the Nazis modeled theirs. The Soviets created the Great Famine in Ukraine, which cost 7 million lives. Russia was the first country in the world to legalize abortion, and in November 1920 encouraged women to have as many abortions as they could, with some having 20 to 30. The Nazis were the second country in the world to legalize it, and now too it has spread around the world and to the United States. The sixth commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. In December of 1917, Communist Russia introduced a law that saw marriage and cohabitation on an equal footing, and divorce, which was only a formality, could be arranged by mail for 5 cents without informing the other spouse. Alexandra Kollontai, the most prominent woman in the Soviet administration, was best known for founding the Soviet Women's Department in 1919, and with it the whole notion of free love, calling for a sexual revolution. She initiated an educational campaign called Love as a Glass of Water, in other words, to quench the thirst, equating the conjugal act as having a glass of water. They advocated casual sex. Women were flogged if they refused. Group sex was encouraged. The world's first so-called gay pride parade took place in St. Petersburg on December the 8th, 1918. Are you beginning to see how the errors have spread? This is what she warned about. And the way to combat this is through the first 5 Saturday devotions. The seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal. The whole communist system was based on plunder. The elimination of private property meant that somebody else got what you had. The eighth commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Soviet propaganda was based on lies, false accusations, and slander. The ninth commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. The decrees and laws issued by the Soviets ridiculed marital fidelity, giving consent to permissiveness and betrayal, and the sexual revolution we spoke about. The 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. The Soviet philosophy hated the rich and any material goods, so they had a brutal form of mass robbery. If you had something, they took it. So here we are. These are the errors of Russia that Our Lady warned about. The dangers referred to her by her are real and relevant today. We must always be on guard and become ever aware of the encroaching dangers. For us Catholics, we can say, the going is fierce, the opposition is powerful, but the victory is already ours. So why then do we behave as though the Church is defeated? We have the promise of the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And in this time of global confusion, we must always remain faithful to Christ and to the immutable and infallible teachings of the Church. We must seriously consider the second condition for peace, the first 5 Saturday devotions. When we do this and embrace Our Lady, the way that God wants us to, so that she be known and loved. Then and only then will we be able to walk on the pathway under her gaze, with her promise that her Immaculate Heart will be our refuge and the way that will lead us to God. God bless you.